In the annals of naval warfare, few battles rival the scale, complexity, and strategic importance of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Fought over 4 harrowing days from October 23 to 26, 1944, this engagement would prove to be not only the largest naval battle of World War II, but by many criteria, the largest naval battle in all of human history. More than 200,000 naval personnel participated in this massive confrontation, representing a collision of naval forces unprecedented in its scope and ferocity. To understand the magnitude of what transpired in those Philippine waters, we must first grasp the strategic situation that had developed by late 1944. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned decisively against Imperial Japan. The Allied campaigns that had begun in August of 1942 and continued through early 1944 had systematically pushed Japanese forces from their island bases across the South and Central Pacific Ocean. Major Japanese strongholds in the Solomon Islands, the Bismarck Archipelago, the Admiralty Islands, New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, and Wake Island had either fallen to Allied assault or been isolated and rendered strategically irrelevant, their garrisons cut off and unable to contribute to Japan's defense. The disparity in naval strength between Japan and the Allied forces had become stark and almost unimaginable. By late 1944, Japan possessed fewer capital ships, meaning aircraft carriers and battleships, than the Allied forces had aircraft carriers alone in the Pacific theater. This single comparison underscores just how dramatically the balance of power had shifted since the war's early years when Japanese naval dominance seemed unassailable. The catastrophic Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 had dealt a devastating blow to Japanese naval aviation. In that engagement, which American pilots would grimly nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the United States Navy destroyed 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, damaged various other Imperial Japanese Navy vessels, and shot down approximately 600 Japanese aircraft. The losses in trained pilots and carrier-borne air power were irreplaceable. Japan's naval aviation capability, once the pride of the empire and the instrument of Pearl Harbor's destruction, had been effectively crippled. Senior Japanese military leaders understood with painful clarity that their remaining naval forces were no longer capable of achieving a strategic victory against the Allies. The mathematics of the situation were inescapable. Yet despite this grim reality, the Japanese General Staff believed that continuing to contest Allied offensives at sea was absolutely necessary. Their reasoning reflected a desperate strategic calculus. They hoped that by making the Allies pay dearly for every advance, they could deter an invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves, buying precious time. Additionally, the Japanese Navy needed to use its remaining strength before it became completely irrelevant, trapped in port by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority. The American advance through the Pacific had breached Japan's strategic inner defense perimeter with the capture of most of the Mariana Islands. This offensive, supported by the U.S. Fifth Fleet's Fast Carrier Task Force, provided the Americans with a base from which their long-range Boeing B-29 Super Fortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. The implications were terrifying for Japan's civilian and military leadership. Their cities and industrial capacity were now within range of sustained strategic bombing. The next logical step in the Allied advance was to sever Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia, thereby depriving the Japanese Empire of the fuel and other critical supplies that sustained its war machine. However, considerable debate existed within the Allied command structure about how best to accomplish this objective. Admiral Ernest J. King, along with other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Admiral Chester Nimitz, favored a strategy of blockading Japanese forces in the Philippines while invading Formosa, known today as Taiwan. In contrast, U.S. Army General Douglas MacArthur championed an invasion of the Philippines themselves, driven in part by his famous 1942 promise to the Filipino people that he would return. The debate over Formosa versus the Philippines as an invasion target reflected more than just military considerations. Formosa could potentially serve as a springboard for an invasion of mainland China, though MacArthur felt such an operation was unnecessary. More practically, an invasion of Formosa would require an enormous commitment of ground forces, estimated at about 12 divisions from the Army and Marines. The Australian Army, already stretched thin by simultaneous engagements across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Dutch East Indies, and various other Pacific islands, would not have been able to contribute additional troops to such an operation. Furthermore, any operation requiring substantially larger ground forces than were currently available in the Pacific theater in late 1944 would need to be delayed until after Germany's defeat, when those forces could be transferred from the European theater. A crucial meeting between MacArthur, Nimitz, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt helped confirm the Philippines as a strategic target, though it did not immediately reach a final decision. The debate continued for 2 more months as planners weighed the military and political implications of each option. Eventually, Admiral Nimitz changed his mind and agreed to MacArthur's plan. The decision was made that MacArthur's forces would invade the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. Amphibious forces and close naval support would be provided by the 7th Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid, while more distant air cover would come from Admiral William F. Halsey Jr.'s 3rd Fleet, with Task Force 38 as its main striking component. This command arrangement, however, contained a fundamental and potentially catastrophic flaw. There would be no single American admiral in overall command of the operation. Kinkaid fell under MacArthur's authority as Supreme Allied Commander Southwest Pacific Area, whereas Halsey's Third Fleet reported to Nimitz as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Ocean Areas. This lack of unified command, combined with failures in communication that would emerge during the battle, would nearly result in strategic disaster for American forces. Ironically, the Japanese plan suffered from the same deficiency, lacking an overall commander and dividing Imperial Japanese Navy forces into 3 separate fleets that would operate with limited coordination. Following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the next possible axes of Allied attacks were readily apparent to Japanese naval planners. Combined Fleet Chief Admiral Somu Toyoda prepared 4 contingency plans designated as victory operations. The most relevant of these was Shogo 1, which envisioned attacking American forces attempting to invade the Philippines. The other plans, Shogo 2, 3, and 4, were conceived as potential responses to American attacks on Formosa, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Kuriil Islands respectively. All these plans called for complex offensive operations and involved committing nearly all available Japanese naval forces to a decisive naval battle, despite the fact that doing so would substantially deplete Japan's already diminishing reserves of fuel oil, a resource that had become critically scarce. On October 12, 1944, Admiral Halsey began a series of carrier raids against Formosa and the Ryukyu Islands, aiming to ensure that Japanese aircraft based there could not interdict the American amphibious landings planned for Leyte. The Japanese command responded by putting Shogo 2 into action, launching waves of air attacks against the Third Fleet's carriers. In what Halsey would later describe as a knockdown, drag-out fight between carrier-based and land-based air power, the Japanese were decisively routed, losing roughly 600 aircraft in just 3 days. This represented almost their entire air strength in the region, another devastating blow to Japan's aerial capabilities. Following the American invasion of the Philippines, the Japanese Navy made the transition to implementing Shogo 1. The Japanese plan was audacious and complex, born of desperation but not without strategic logic. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Northern Force would serve as a decoy, built around several Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carriers. However, these carriers would be equipped with very few aircraft or trained aircrew. Their sole purpose was to lure the American Fast Carrier Task Force away from Leyte. As the U.S. covering forces were drawn away by Ozawa's carriers, 2 other Japanese surface fleets would advance on Leyte from the west. The Southern Force, under Vice Admirals Shoji Nishimura and Kiyohide Shima, would strike at the landing area via the Surigao Strait. Meanwhile, the Center Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, by far the most powerful of the attacking Japanese forces, would pass through the San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea, turn southwards, and then attack the landing area from the north. Admiral Toyoda's strategic thinking reflected the desperate situation facing Japan. He stated that if they lost in the Philippines operations, even if the fleet survived, the shipping lanes to the south would be completely severed. The fleet would be unable to obtain fuel supplies if it returned to Japanese waters, and unable to receive ammunition and arms if it remained in southern waters. In Toyoda's view, there would be no sense in preserving the fleet at the expense of losing the Philippines. This was to be an all-or-nothing gamble with Japan's remaining naval strength. As Vice Admiral Kurita's powerful center force sortied from its base in Brunei, it represented a formidable armada. The force consisted of 5 battleships, including the Yamato and Musashi, 2 of the largest and most powerful warships ever constructed, each displacing more than 60,000 tons. These massive vessels represented the pinnacle of battleship design, armed with 18.1-inch guns capable of firing shells weighing over 3,000 pounds. Accompanying them were the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna. The force also included 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers, representing a concentration of naval firepower that would have been decisive in any surface engagement. The first significant action of the battle occurred on the night of October 22 to 23 as Kurita's ships passed Palawan Island. The American submarines Darter and Dace were positioned together on the surface nearby, conducting their patrol routine. At 1:16 in the morning on October 23, Darter's radar detected the Japanese formation in the Palawan Passage at a range of 30,000 yards. Her captain promptly made visual contact and began tracking the enemy formation. The 2 submarines quickly moved off in pursuit of the ships, while Darter transmitted the first of 3 contact reports. At least one of these critical reports was picked up by a radio operator aboard the Yamato, but Vice Admiral Kurita failed to take appropriate anti-submarine precautions, a mistake that would prove costly. Darter and Dace traveled on the surface at full power for several hours, racing ahead to gain a position from which they could make a submerged attack at first light. This attack would prove unusually successful, demonstrating the deadly effectiveness of American submarine tactics. At 5:24 in the morning, Darter fired a salvo of 6 torpedoes. At least 4 of these struck Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Atego. 10 minutes later, using her stern tubes to launch another spread of torpedoes, Darter scored 2 hits on the Atego's sister ship, Takao. At 5:56, Dace achieved 4 torpedo hits on the heavy cruiser Maya, another sister ship to Atago and Takao. The results were devastating for the Japanese force. Atago and Maya both went down quickly with significant loss of life. The Atago sank so rapidly that Admiral Kurita himself was forced to swim for his life. He was rescued by the Japanese destroyer Kishinami and later transferred to the battleship Yamato, where he would continue to command his force. The Takao, severely damaged, turned back toward Brunei escorted by 2 destroyers. The 2 American submarines followed, continuing to shadow the crippled cruiser. On October 24, as the submarines maintained their pursuit of Takao, disaster struck the darter. She ran aground on the Bombay Shoal, and despite all efforts to free her, she remained stuck fast. The submarine had to be abandoned, with her entire crew successfully rescued by Dace. Multiple attempts to scuttle Darter over the course of the following week all failed. Torpedoes from Dace and Rock hit the reef rather than the submarine itself, and deck gun shelling from Dace and later from Nautilus proved insufficient to completely destroy her. After multiple hits from his 6-inch deck guns, the Nautilus commander determined on October 31 that the equipment remaining on Darter was only good for scrap and left her there. The Japanese, for their part, did not bother with the wreck. The Takao eventually retired to Singapore, where she would be joined in January of 1945 by another crippled cruiser, Myoko. The Japanese deemed both vessels irreparable and left them moored in the harbor to serve as floating anti-aircraft batteries for the remainder of the war. Despite its impressive strength, the U.S. Third Fleet was not optimally positioned to deal with the looming Japanese threat as it became apparent on October 24. On October 22, Admiral Halsey had detached 2 of his carrier groups to the fleet base at Ulithi to take on provisions and rearm. When Darter's contact report came in, Halsey recalled one group commanded by Admiral Davison, but he allowed Vice Admiral John S. McCain, commanding the strongest of Task Force 38's carrier groups, to continue toward Ulithi. Halsey would not recall McCain until October 24, but by then the delay meant that the most powerful American carrier group would play little part in the coming battle. Third Fleet was therefore effectively deprived of nearly 40% of its air strength for most of the engagement that followed. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea unfolded on October 24 as American carrier aircraft discovered and attacked Kurita's center force. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi directed 3 waves of aircraft from his 1st Air Fleet based on Luzon against the carriers of Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman's Task Group 38.3. Each of Onishi's strike waves consisted of approximately 50 to 60 aircraft, representing a substantial aerial threat. Most of the attacking Japanese planes were intercepted and shot down or driven off by Hellcats of Sherman's Combat Air Patrol. Particularly notable was the action by 2 fighter sections from USS Essex led by Commander David McCampbell, who shot down a record 9 of the attacking planes in the single engagement. After exhausting his ammunition, McCampbell managed to return and land on USS Langley because the Essex's deck was too busy to accommodate him, despite the fact that he had nearly run out of fuel. His performance that day exemplified the skill and determination of American naval aviators. However, one Japanese aircraft, a Yokosuka D-4Y-3 dive bomber, slipped through the defenses. At 9:38 in the morning, it struck the light carrier USS Princeton with a 551-pound armor-piercing bomb. The timing could not have been worse for Princeton. Just prior to the bomb hitting the carrier, 10 fighter planes had landed on the flight deck from a previous mission, and in the hangar deck, 6 fully loaded and fueled Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers were waiting for their next mission. One of these torpedo bombers was directly hit by the bomb as it pierced through the ship and exploded. This triggered a catastrophic chain reaction as the other 5 torpedo bombers also exploded. The bomb had struck an area of the ship where not only were most of the torpedoes stored, but also bombs that were not stored securely. The resulting explosion caused a severe fire in Princeton's hangar, and tragically, her emergency sprinkler system failed to operate. As the fire spread rapidly through the ship, a series of secondary explosions followed. The ship's crew fought desperately to bring the fire under control, and they were making progress when disaster struck again. At 3:23 in the afternoon, there was an enormous explosion, probably in the carrier's bomb stowage aft, causing more casualties aboard Princeton and even heavier casualties aboard the light cruiser Birmingham, which had come alongside to assist with firefighting. 241 men were killed and 412 were wounded aboard Birmingham alone. The light cruiser was so badly damaged by this explosion that she was forced to retire from the battle area. All efforts to save Princeton ultimately failed. After the remaining crew members were evacuated, she was finally scuttled, torpedoed by the light cruiser Reno at 5:50 in the evening. Of Princeton's crew, 108 men were killed, while 1,361 survivors were rescued by nearby ships. USS Princeton would be the largest American ship lost during the battles around Leyte Gulf and the only Independence-class fast carrier sunk in combat during the entire war. 17 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters and 12 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers went down with the ship. While the drama around Princeton unfolded, American carrier aircraft launched sustained attacks against Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea. Planes from the carriers Intrepid and Cabot attacked at about 10:30 in the morning, scoring hits on the battleships Nagato, Yamato, and Musashi, and badly damaging the heavy cruiser Myoko, which retired toward Borneo. A second wave from Intrepid, Essex, and Lexington later attacked, with dive bombers and fighters from Essex scoring another 10 hits on the massive battleship Musashi. As she withdrew, listing to port, a third wave from Enterprise and Franklin struck her with an additional 11 bombs and 8 torpedoes. The destruction of Musashi became the focal point of American air attacks that day. After being struck by at least 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes, the giant battleship, one of the 2 largest warships ever constructed, finally capsized and sank at about 7:35 in the evening. The sinking of this Leviathan represented a tremendous expenditure of ordnance and effort. In total, 5 fleet carriers and 1 light carrier of 3rd Fleet flew 259 sorties against center force on October 24, with bombs carried by dive bombers and torpedoes launched by Avenger torpedo bombers. Yet despite this massive weight of attack, it was not nearly sufficient to neutralize the threat from Kurita's force. The largest effort of the Shibuyan Sea attack was directed against just one battleship, Musashi, and while she was indeed sunk, and the cruiser Myoko was crippled, every other ship in Kurita's force remained battleworthy and able to advance. This fact would have profound implications for the following day's action. It would ultimately be the desperate effort and great sacrifice of a much weaker force of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts at the Battle off Samar, vessels utterly lacking incredible weapons to sink heavily armored warships, that would stop Kurita's advance. Admiral Kurita had turned his fleet around temporarily to get out of range of the attacking aircraft, passing the crippled Musashi as his force retreated. Admiral Halsey, observing this withdrawal, assumed that the threat from center force had been dealt with for the time being. However, Kurita waited only until 5:15 in the evening before turning around again to head for the San Bernardino Strait. As a result of a momentous decision taken by Admiral Halsey and some critically unclear communication of his plans, Kurita would be able to proceed through the San Bernardino Strait during the night, making an unexpected and dramatic appearance off the coast of Samar the following morning, directly threatening the Leyte landings. The confusion surrounding Task Force 34 would prove to be one of the most controversial aspects of the entire battle. After the Japanese southern and center forces had been detected, but before Ozawa's carriers had been located, Halsey and his staff aboard the battleship New Jersey prepared a contingency plan to deal with the threat from Kurita's center force. Their intention was to cover San Bernardino Strait with a powerful task force of fast battleships supported by carrier groups. This battleship force was to be designated Task Force 34 and would consist of 4 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 14 destroyers under the command of Vice Admiral Willis A. Lee. At 15:12 on October 24, Halsey sent what would become an infamous radio message to his subordinate commanders, detailing this contingency plan. The message specified which ships would form Task Force 34 and stated that the force would be formed under Vice Admiral Lee's command. Critically, Halsey sent information copies of this message to Admiral Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters and Admiral King in Washington, but he did not include Admiral Kincaid of 7th Fleet as an addressee. Nevertheless, 7th Fleet intercepted the message, as it was common practice for admirals to direct their radio operators to copy all message traffic they detected, whether intended for them or not. The problem lay in Halsey's wording. When he wrote that Task Force 34 would be formed, he intended this in the future tense, as a contingency plan to be activated when he ordered it. However, he neglected to specify when Task Force 34 would be formed or under what circumstances. This crucial omission led Admiral Kincaid to interpret the message as meaning that Task Force 34 had already been formed and would take station off San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor reached exactly the same conclusion. Halsey did send out a second message at 17:10 clarifying his intentions, stating that if the enemy sortied through San Bernardino Strait, Task Force 34 would be formed when directed by him. Unfortunately, this crucial clarification was sent by voice radio, which 7th Fleet did not intercept due to the range limitations of ship-to-ship voice radio networks. Halsey also failed to follow up with a telegraphic message to Nimitz, King, or critically, to Kincaid. This serious misunderstanding would have a profound influence on the subsequent course of the battle. 3rd Fleet's aircraft failed to locate Ozawa's northern force until 1640 on October 24. This delay occurred largely because 3rd Fleet had been preoccupied with attacking Kurita's center force and defending itself against Japanese airstrikes from Luzon. When Ozawa's force was finally discovered, Halsey fell completely for the Japanese decoy. Convinced that the northern force constituted the main Japanese threat, and determined to seize what he saw as a golden opportunity to destroy Japan's last remaining carrier strength, Halsey made his fateful decision. Believing that center force had been neutralized by the day's airstrikes in the Shibuyan Sea and was retiring, Halsey radioed that he was proceeding north with 3 groups to attack the carrier forces at dawn. The phrase, "with 3 groups," proved dangerously misleading. In light of the earlier intercepted message about Task Force 34 being formed, Admiral Kincaid and his staff assumed, as did Admiral Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters, that Task Force 34 had been detached as a separate entity. They believed Halsey was leaving this powerful surface force guarding San Bernardino Strait while taking his carrier groups northward in pursuit of the Japanese carriers. But Task Force 34 had not been formed or detached, and Lee's battleships were steaming north with the carriers. Everything was pulled out from San Bernardino Strait. Not so much as a single picket destroyer was left to guard this critical passage. Halsey and his staff officers ignored several warning signs that night. Information from a night reconnaissance aircraft operating from the light carrier Independence indicated that Kurita's surface force had turned back towards San Bernardino Strait and that the navigation lights in the strait, after a long blackout, had been turned on. When Rear Admiral Gerald F. Bogan, commanding a carrier task group, radioed this vital information to Halsey's flagship, he was rebuffed by a staff officer who tersely replied, "Yes, we have that information." Vice Admiral Lee, who had correctly deduced that Ozawa's force was on a decoy mission and indicated this in a message to Halsey's flagship, was similarly dismissed. Senior officers on Admiral Mitcher's staff, including Commodore Arleigh Burke and Commander James Flatley, had reached the same conclusion and were sufficiently worried to wake Mitcher. When Mitcher asked if Halsey had received the reports and was told that he had, Mitcher simply commented, "If he wants my advice he'll ask for it," and went back to sleep. The entire available strength of 3rd Fleet continued to steam northward toward Ozawa's decoy force, leaving San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Nothing now stood between the battleships of Kurita's center force and the American landing vessels except for Kinkaid's vulnerable escort carrier groups off the coast of Samar. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Nishimura's southern force was approaching the Surigao Strait from the south. His force consisted of the old battleships Yamashiro, which served as his flagship, and Fuso, along with the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers. This task force had left Brunei after Kurita on October 22, turning eastward into the Sulu Sea and then proceeding northeastward toward the southern entrance to Surigao Strait. Nishimura intended to exit the northern entrance of the strait into Leyte Gulf, where he would add his firepower to that of Kurita's force attacking from the north. The Japanese 2nd Striking Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima, comprised the heavy cruisers Nachi and Ashigara, the light cruiser Abukuma, and 4 destroyers. This force followed approximately 25 nautical miles behind Nishimura. Due to the strict radio silence imposed on the center and southern forces, Nishimura was unable to synchronize his movements with either Shima or Kurita. When he entered Surigao Strait at 2 o'clock in the morning on October 25, Kurita was still in the Sibuyan Sea, several hours away from the beaches at Leyte. As Nishimura's southern force approached Surigao Strait, it was heading into a deadly trap meticulously prepared by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. The American force positioned across the northern exit of the strait was substantial and overwhelming. Oldendorf commanded 6 battleships: West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. 5 of these 6 battleships had been sunk or damaged in the attack on Pearl Harbor and subsequently repaired or rebuilt. They carried a total of 48 14-inch and 16 16-inch guns. Supporting them were 4 heavy cruisers with 35 8-inch guns, 4 light cruisers with 54 6-inch guns, and 28 destroyers and 39 motor torpedo boats. To pass through the Narrows and reach the invasion shipping, Nishimura would have to run a gauntlet of torpedoes from PT boats and destroyers before advancing into the concentrated fire of battleships and cruisers deployed across the mouth of the strait. The Battle of Surigao Strait, which unfolded in the early morning hours of October 25, would prove to be the last battleship-to-battleship action in history. It was one of only 2 such naval battles in the Pacific Campaign of World War II, the other being the naval battle during the Guadalcanal Campaign. It would also be the most recent battle in which one force was able to cross the T of its opponent, a classic naval maneuver in which a line of warships crosses in front of the enemy line, allowing all guns to bear while the enemy can only use forward-facing weapons. At 22:36 on the evening of October 24, American PT boats made contact with the approaching Japanese ships. The PT boats conducted repeated attacks for more than 3.5 hours as Nishimura's force streamed northward through the strait. While they scored no torpedo hits, the PT boats sent contact reports that proved invaluable to Oldendorf and his force, keeping them informed of the enemy's approach. Nishimura's ships passed through the gauntlet of PT boats unscathed, but their luck ran out when they encountered devastating torpedo attacks from American destroyers deployed on both sides of their axis of advance. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, both Japanese battleships were hit by torpedoes. Yamashiro was able to continue steaming, but Fuso was struck by torpedoes from USS Melvin and fell out of formation, sinking 40 minutes later. 2 of Nishimura's 4 destroyers were sunk outright, and the destroyer Asaguma was hit and forced to retire, though she later sank as well. At 3:16, West Virginia's radar picked up the surviving ships of Nishimura's force at a range of 42,000 yards in the pitch-black night. West Virginia tracked them as they approached. At 3:53, she opened fire with the 8 16-inch guns of her main battery at a range of 22,800 yards, striking Yamashiro with her first salvo. She went on to fire a total of 93 shells. At 3:55, California and Tennessee joined the battle, firing 63 and 69 shells respectively from their 14-inch guns. The advanced radar fire control systems on these American battleships allowed them to hit targets from distances at which the Japanese battleships, with their inferior fire control systems, could not return effective fire. The other American battleships also engaged the enemy. Maryland eventually succeeded in visually ranging on the splashes of other battleship shells and fired a total of 48 16-inch projectiles. Mississippi fired only once in the battle line action, a full salvo of 12 14-inch shells. This would prove to be the last salvo ever fired by one battleship against another battleship in history, closing a significant chapter in naval warfare that had begun centuries earlier with ships of the line engaging broadside to broadside. Yamashiro and Mogami were crippled by the combination of 16-inch and 14-inch armor-piercing shells, as well as the fire from Oldendorf's flanking cruisers. The cruisers equipped with the latest radar fired well over 2,000 rounds of 6-inch and 8-inch shells. The Japanese command had apparently lost any grasp of the tactical picture, with ships firing all batteries in multiple directions. At 4:05, Yamashiro was struck by a torpedo fired by the destroyer Benyon and suddenly sank at about 4:20, taking Vice Admiral Nishimura down with her. The destroyer Shiger and the cruiser Mogami turned and fled southward down the strait. Vice Admiral Shima's second striking force approached Surigao Strait approximately 40 miles behind Nishimura. Shima's approach was initially thrown into confusion when his force nearly ran aground on Panaon Island after failing to factor the outgoing tide into their navigation. When Shima's force encountered remnants of Nishimura's force and saw what appeared to be the wrecks of both battleships, he ordered a retreat before coming into range of the American battleships and cruisers. In the confusion, his flagship Nachi collided with the damaged Mogami, flooding Mogami's steering room and causing her to fall behind. Mogami was further damaged by American carrier aircraft the next morning and was eventually abandoned and scuttled. Of Nishimura's original 7 ships, only the destroyer Shiger survived long enough to escape, though she would be sunk by an American submarine in January of 1945. As dawn broke on October 25, the escort carriers of Taffy 1, which had been supporting American surface ships after the Battle of Surigao Strait, came under attack from the first pre-planned kamikaze attacks of the Pacific War. These were suicide attacks launched from Davao, representing a desperate new Japanese tactic. The escort carrier Santee was hit first by a kamikaze, killing 16 crewmen, and then struck by a torpedo from a Japanese submarine, though emergency repairs saved her from sinking. The escort carrier Sewanee was hit by a kamikaze that killed 71 sailors, and then struck by another kamikaze the following day that caused even more damage and killed 36 more crewmen. A total of 107 sailors were killed and over 150 wounded on Sewanee in these attacks. Far to the north, off the coast of Samar, the most desperate and unlikely action of the entire battle was about to unfold. Kurita's center force had emerged unopposed from San Bernardino Strait at 3 o'clock in the morning on October 25 and steamed southward along the coast of Samar. In its path stood only 7th Fleet's escort carrier units, with a total of 16 small, very slow, and unarmored escort carriers protected by a screen of lightly armed destroyers and destroyer escorts. Despite losses in earlier actions, Kurita's center force still consisted of 4 battleships, including the giant Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. At approximately 6:45 in the morning, Japanese lookouts spotted the escort carriers of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Task Unit 77.4.3, known by its call sign Taffy 3. For Sprague and his men, the appearance of Japanese battleship pagoda masts on the horizon was a nightmarish surprise. These escort carriers were designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support of ground troops, not for engaging heavy surface warships. Each carrier was protected by a single 5-inch gun, utterly inadequate against armored battleships and cruisers. Sprague immediately directed his carriers to launch their planes and ran for the cover of a rain squall to the east. He ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts to make a smoke screen to conceal the retreating carriers. Kurita, unaware that Ozawa's decoy plan had succeeded and that Halsey had taken all of 3rd Fleet north, assumed he had encountered a carrier group from Halsey's fleet. Having just redeployed his ships into anti-aircraft formation, he compounded the confusion by ordering a general attack, which called for his fleet to split into divisions and attack independently rather than maintaining formation. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, was closest to the enemy. On his own initiative, Evans steered his outclassed ship directly into the Japanese fleet at flank speed. Johnston fired all her torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano, damaging her and forcing her out of line. Seeing this audacious attack, Sprague gave the order for all his screening ships to attack. Taffy 3's 2 other destroyers, Hole and Heerman, along with the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, charged into battle with what could only be described as suicidal determination. As these small ships approached the enemy columns, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of Samuel B. Roberts told all hands via bullhorn that this would be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts drew fire and disrupted the Japanese formation as ships turned to avoid their torpedoes. As the Japanese fleet continued to close, Hull and Roberts were hit multiple times and quickly sank beneath the waves. After expending all of its torpedoes, Johnston continued to fight with its 5-inch guns until it was finally sunk by a group of Japanese destroyers. The courage displayed by these small ships and their crews in the face of impossible odds would become legendary in naval history. Meanwhile, as they were preparing their aircraft for attack, the escort carriers themselves returned Japanese fire with all the firepower they possessed, which amounted to one 5-inch gun per carrier. The officer in tactical command had instructed the carriers to open with pea shooters, and each ship engaged an enemy vessel as soon as it came within range. These small guns were never intended to fight battleships, yet the carriers used them with determination. Fanshawe Bay fired on a cruiser and is believed to have registered 5 hits. Kalinin Bay targeted a heavy cruiser, claiming hits on the vessel's No. 2 turret. Gambier Bay sighted a cruiser and claimed at least 3 hits. White Plains reported hits on multiple targets. While these small-caliber hits could not seriously damage armored warships, they demonstrated the fighting spirit of crews who refused to surrender without a fight. Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague, commanding officer of all 3 Taffy groups and not related to Clifton Sprague, ordered the 16 escort carriers in his 3 task units to immediately launch all available aircraft, totaling 450 planes, equipped with whatever weapons they had available, even if these were only machine guns or depth charges. The escort carriers typically carried planes more suited for patrol and anti-submarine duties, including older models such as the FM-2 Wildcat fighter, though they also had TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. This stood in contrast to Halsey's fleet carriers, which carried the newest aircraft with ample anti-shipping ordnance. However, the critical fact that the Japanese force had no air cover whatsoever meant that Sprague's planes could attack completely unopposed by Japanese fighter aircraft. Consequently, the air counterattacks became almost unceasing throughout the morning. Some strikes, especially several launched from Felix Stump's Task Unit 77.4.2, known as Taffy 2, were particularly heavy and effective. The pilots displayed remarkable courage and ingenuity, making repeated attacks even after exhausting their anti-ship weapons, conducting strafing runs to distract Japanese gunners and disrupt their aim. The carriers of Taffy 3 turned south and retreated through intense shell fire. Gambier Bay, positioned at the rear of the American formation, became the focus of attention from the battleship Yamato and sustained multiple hits from the giant vessel's massive guns before capsizing at 9:07 in the morning. 4 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers went down with Gambier Bay. Several other carriers were damaged by Japanese shellfire but managed to escape, though their survival seemed miraculous given the disparity in force. The ferocity and effectiveness of the American defense seemingly confirmed the Japanese assumption that they were engaging major fleet units rather than merely escort carriers and destroyers. The confusion created by Kurita's general attack order was compounded by the constant air and torpedo attacks. At a critical moment, Kurita's flagship Yamato was forced to turn north to evade torpedoes and lost contact with the rest of the battle. The Japanese formation became increasingly disorganized as individual division commanders pursued separate targets. Then, at approximately 9:20 in the morning, when victory seemed within Kurita's grasp, he abruptly broke off the engagement and gave the order for all ships to head north at 20 knots, apparently to regroup his disorganized fleet. Kurita's battle report stated he had received a message indicating a group of American carriers was steaming north of his position. Preferring to expend his remaining fleet strength against capital ships rather than transport vessels, Kurita set out in pursuit of this reported carrier force and thereby lost his opportunity to destroy the vulnerable shipping in Leyte Gulf and disrupt the vital amphibious landings on Leyte itself. After failing to intercept these carriers, which were actually much farther north than reported, Kurita finally ordered a retreat towards San Bernardino Strait. 3 of his heavy cruisers had been sunk during the engagement, and the determined American resistance had convinced him that persisting with his attack would only result in further Japanese losses without achieving decisive results. Poor communication between the separate Japanese forces and a complete lack of air reconnaissance meant that Kurita was never properly informed that the northern decoy plan had been successful, and that only the small and hopelessly outgunned force had stood between his battleships and the vulnerable transport ships of the invasion fleet. Kurita remained convinced throughout the battle that he had been engaging elements of Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, and he believed it would only be a matter of time before Halsey's fast battleships arrived to surround and annihilate his force. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague would later write that the main reason the Japanese turned away was that they were receiving too much damage to continue, and he remained of that opinion. Almost all of Kurita's surviving force managed to escape back through San Bernardino Strait. Halsey and Third Fleet's battleships, still far to the north, returned too late to intercept and destroy the retreating Japanese force. The battleships Nagato and Kongo had been moderately damaged by air attacks from Taffy 3's aircraft. Kurita had begun the battle with 5 battleships, but on their return to base, only Yamato and Haruna remained battle-worthy. As the desperate surface action off Samar was coming to an end, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi put his special attack units into operation from bases on Luzon, launching kamikaze attacks against the Allied ships in Leyte Gulf and the escort carrier units off Samar. This was the second organized kamikaze attack by the Japanese in World War II, following the earlier attack on Taffy 1 near Surigao Strait. The escort carrier St. Lo of Taffy 3 was struck by a kamikaze aircraft and sank after a series of catastrophic internal explosions. 6 Grumman FM-2 Wildcat fighters and 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers went down with St. Lo. 3 other Taffy 3 escort carriers, Kalinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, and White Plains, were also damaged in the same kamikaze attack. The age of the kamikaze had begun in earnest, introducing a terrifying new dimension to the naval war in the Pacific. Far to the north, the battle off Cape Engano was unfolding as Halsey's Third Fleet engaged Vice Admiral Ozawa's northern force. Ozawa's force was built around 4 aircraft carriers, the fleet carrier Zuikaku, the last survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the light carriers Zuho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The force also included 2 World War I battleships that had been partially converted to carriers, Hyuga and ISE, though neither ship carried any aircraft in this battle. 3 light cruisers and 9 destroyers completed the force. Ozawa's entire carrier group had been divested of all but 108 aircraft and was intended purely as a decoy to lure Halsey away from Leyte. Ironically, the name of the cape for which this battle is named, Engano, is Spanish for deception, fitting the battle's purpose perfectly. Ozawa's force was not located until 1640 on October 24, largely because the American carrier group responsible for searches in that sector had been preoccupied with the action in the Sibuyan Sea and defending against Japanese airstrikes from Luzon. Thus, Ozawa's group, the one Japanese force that desperately wanted to be discovered to fulfill its mission, was the only force the Americans had been unable to find for most of the day. When Halsey finally turned north with 3 groups of Task Force 38, he commanded an overwhelmingly superior force. Between his carrier groups, Halsey had 5 large fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 6 modern battleships, 8 cruisers, and 41 destroyers. The air groups of these 10 American carriers contained between 600 and 1,000 aircraft, a force that completely dwarfed Ozawa's meager air strength. At 2:40 in the morning on October 25, Halsey detached Task Force 34, built around 3rd Fleet's 6 battleships and commanded by Vice Admiral Lee. As dawn approached, the battleships drew ahead of the carrier groups. Halsey's plan called for Mitcher's carriers to make air strikes first, followed by the heavy gunfire of Lee's battleships to finish off any surviving Japanese vessels. Around dawn on October 25, Ozawa launched 75 aircraft, representing the bulk of his limited air strength, to attack 3rd Fleet. Most were shot down by American combat air patrols, and no damage was inflicted on the American ships. A few Japanese planes survived and made their way to land bases on Luzon. During the night, Halsey had passed tactical command of Task Force 38 to Admiral Mitcher, who ordered the American carrier groups to launch their first strike wave of 180 aircraft at dawn, even before the northern force had been precisely located. When search aircraft finally made contact at 7:10, this strike wave was already orbiting ahead of the task force, ready to attack. At 8 o'clock, as the attack commenced, its escorting fighters destroyed Ozawa's combat air patrol of about 30 planes. The American airstrikes continued relentlessly until evening, by which time Task Force 38 had flown 527 sorties against the northern force. The results were devastating for the Japanese. The fleet carrier Zuikaku, the light carriers Chitose and Zuho, and the destroyer Akizuki were all sunk with heavy loss of life. Zuikaku, the last carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, went down with her crew saluting as the flag was lowered on the listing carrier. The light carrier Chiyoda and the cruiser Tama were crippled. Ozawa transferred his flag to the light cruiser Iodo as his flagship went down. The Japanese decoy had succeeded brilliantly in luring Halsey north, but the price paid by Ozawa's sailors was terrible. Shortly after 8 o'clock on October 25, desperate messages calling for assistance began arriving from 7th Fleet, which had been engaging the southern force in Surigao Strait and was now facing Kurita's unexpected appearance off Samar. One message from Kincaid, sent in plain language, read, "My situation is critical. Fast battleships and support by airstrikes may be able to keep enemy from destroying escort carriers and entering Leyte." Admiral Halsey would later recall in his memoirs that he was shocked by this message, though the radio signals from 7th Fleet had arrived at random and out of order because of a backlog in the communications office. It appears that Halsey did not receive this vital message until around 10 o'clock, more than 3 hours after Kurita had engaged Taffy 3. One of the most alarming signals from Kincaid reported that after their action in Surigao Strait, 7th Fleet's battleships were critically low on ammunition. Even this urgent message failed to persuade Halsey to send immediate assistance to 7th Fleet. In fact, 7th Fleet's battleships were not as short of ammunition as Kincaid's signal implied, though Halsey had no way of knowing this at the time. From 3,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz had been monitoring the desperate calls from Taffy 3. He sent Halsey a message that would become famous, or perhaps infamous, in naval history. The message read, "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." The first 4 words and the last 3 were padding used to confuse enemy cryptanalysis. The communications staff on Halsey's flagship correctly deleted the first section of padding but mistakenly retained the last 3 words in the message handed to Halsey. These last 3 words may have been meant as a loose quotation from Tennyson's poem about the charge of the Light Brigade, suggested by the coincidence that October 25th was the 90th anniversary of the Battle of Balaclava. Halsey, however, when reading the message, believed that the words, "the world wonders," were a biting piece of criticism from Nimitz. According to witnesses, he threw his cap to the deck and broke into what were described as sobs of rage. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Robert Kearney, confronted him and told him to pull himself together. Eventually, at 11:15, more than 3 hours after the first distress messages from 7th Fleet had been received, Halsey ordered Task Force 34 to turn around and head southward toward Samar. At this point, Lee's battleships were almost within gun range of Ozawa's remaining force. 2.5 hours were then spent refueling Task Force 34's accompanying destroyers, further delaying their southward movement. After this succession of delays, it was far too late for Task Force 34 to provide any practical assistance to 7th Fleet beyond helping to pick up survivors from Taffy 3. It was also too late to intercept Kurita's force before it escaped through San Bernardino Strait. Nevertheless, at 1622, in a desperate and belated attempt to intervene, Halsey formed a new task group built around 3rd Fleet's 2 fastest battleships, Iowa and New Jersey, both capable of speeds exceeding 32 knots, along with 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers. This group sped southward while Lee and the other 4 battleships followed more slowly. If this fast group had succeeded in intercepting Kurita's center force, it might ironically have been outgunned by the Japanese battleships, despite the Americans' superior speed. The cruisers and destroyers of this fast task group did manage to catch the Japanese destroyer Milwaukee, the last straggler from center force, off San Bernardino Strait, and sank her with all hands, including survivors from the sunken cruiser Chikuma who had been aboard. When Halsey had turned Task Force 34 southward at 11:15, he detached a group of 4 cruisers and 9 destroyers under Rear Admiral Dubose and reassigned this group to Task Force 38. At 14:15, Admiral Mitcher ordered Dubose to pursue the remnants of the Japanese northern force. His cruisers finished off the crippled light carrier Chiyoda at around 1700 hours, and at 20:59 his ships sank the destroyer Hatsuzuki after what was described as a very stubborn fight by the Japanese crew. When Ozawa learned of the deployment of Dubose's relatively weak task group, he ordered his battleships ISE and Hyuga to turn southward and attack it. These converted battleships heavily outgunned Dubose's cruisers, and had they made contact, the result could have been disastrous for the Americans. However, they failed to locate Dubose's group in the darkness and confusion. Halsey's withdrawal of all 6 of Lee's battleships in his desperate attempt to assist 7th Fleet had rendered Task Force 38 temporarily vulnerable to a surface counterattack by the very decoy northern force it had been sent to destroy. At approximately 23:10 on October 25th, the American submarine Jaleo torpedoed and sank the light cruiser Tama from Ozawa's force. This was the last action of the battle off Cape Ingano and, apart from some final airstrikes against retreating Japanese forces on October 26, marked the conclusion of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The decisions made by Admiral Halsey during this battle would be debated and analyzed for decades to come. Halsey was severely questioned for his decision to take Task Force 34 north in pursuit of Ozawa's carriers, and for his failure to detach it when Kinkaid first appealed for help. A piece of U.S. Navy slang for Halsey's actions emerged, called Bull's Run, a phrase combining Halsey's newspaper nickname Bull with an allusion to the Battle of Bull Run in the American Civil War. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3 during the desperate battle off Samar, was later bitterly critical of Halsey's decision and of his failure to clearly inform Kinkaid and 7th Fleet that their northern flank was no longer protected. Sprague noted that in the absence of any information to the contrary, it was logical to assume that the northern flank could not be exposed without ample warning. Naval historian Samuel Morrison wrote that if Task Force 34 had been detached a few hours earlier, after Kinkaid's first urgent request for help, and had left the destroyers behind since their fueling caused a delay of over 2.5 hours, a powerful battle line of 6 modern battleships under Admiral Lee, the most experienced battle squadron commander in the Navy, would have arrived off San Bernardino Strait in time to clash with Kurita's center force. Apart from the accidents common in naval warfare, there is every reason to suppose that Lee would have crossed the T and completed the destruction of center force. The mighty gunfire of 3rd Fleet's battle line, greater than that of the entire Japanese Navy, was never brought into action except to finish off 1 or 2 crippled light ships. Vice Admiral Lee himself noted in his action report that no battle damage was incurred or inflicted on the enemy by vessels while operating as Task Force 34. In his defense, Halsey argued in his dispatch after the battle that searches by his carrier planes had revealed the presence of the Northern Carrier Force on the afternoon of October 24, which completed the picture of all enemy naval forces. He stated that it seemed childish to him to guard the San Bernardino Strait statically, so he concentrated Task Force 38 during the night and steamed north to attack the northern force at dawn. Halsey believed that the center force had been so heavily damaged in the Sibuyan Sea that it could no longer be considered a serious threat to 7th Fleet. He also argued that he had feared leaving Task Force 34 to defend the strait without carrier support, as that would have left the battleships vulnerable to attack from land-based aircraft. Several factors may have influenced Halsey's decisions beyond pure tactical considerations. Halsey strongly believed in the naval doctrine of force concentration, as indicated by his writings both before and during World War II. He may also have been influenced by recent criticisms of Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had been criticized for excessive caution in the Battle of the Philippine Sea when he allowed much of the Japanese fleet to escape. Halsey's Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Robert Carney, was also wholeheartedly in favor of taking all of Third Fleet's available forces northward to attack the Japanese carriers. Additionally, Halsey did not fully appreciate just how badly compromised Japan's naval air power had become. He had no idea that Ozawa's decoy force carried only 100 aircraft. Halsey later stated that he did not want to be shuttle-bombed, whereby attacking planes from Ozawa's force could refuel and rearm at land bases, allowing them to attack again on the return flight. He also did not want to give the Japanese a free shot at American forces in Leyte Gulf. In a master's thesis submitted at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Lieutenant Commander Kent Coleman argued that the divided command structure, with 3rd Fleet reporting to Nimitz and 7th Fleet reporting to MacArthur, was the primary contributor to the near success of Kurita's attack. This divided command amplified problems in communication and coordination between Halsey and Kinkaid. The losses sustained during the Battle of Leyte Gulf reflect the scale and intensity of this massive engagement. The United States lost at least 11 warships during the battle. These included the light aircraft carrier Princeton, 2 escort carriers Gambier Bay and St. Lo, 2 destroyers Hull and Johnston, 1 destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, and 1 PT boat. 4 other ships were damaged, including the submarine Darter, which ran aground. More than 1,600 sailors and aircrew from the Allied escort carrier units were killed. The losses were not evenly distributed across the various engagements. Very minimal Allied casualties occurred at the overwhelming victories in Surigao Strait and off Cape Anguano. At the battle off Samar alone, 5 of the 7 ships lost in the entire battle went down, along with 1,161 killed and missing and 913 wounded, casualties comparable to the combined American losses at the battles of Midway and Coral Sea. As a result of communication errors and other failures, a large number of survivors from Taffy 3 were not rescued for several days and died unnecessarily as a consequence, adding to the tragic toll. The Japanese losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 26 warships during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. These included 1 fleet aircraft carrier, Zuikaku, the last of the original Pearl Harbor attack carriers still afloat. 3 light aircraft carriers, Zuho, Chiyoda, and Chitose, were sunk. 3 battleships went down, the massive Musashi, former flagship of the combined fleet, along with Yamashiro and Fuso. 6 heavy cruisers were lost, Atago, which had been Kurita's flagship, along with Maya, Suzuya, Chokai, Chikuma, and Mogami. 4 light cruisers, Noshiro, Abyakuma, Tama, and Kinu, were sunk. 9 destroyers were also lost. These listed losses include only ships sunk during the battle itself. After the nominal end of the battle, several damaged ships faced the difficult choice of making their way to Singapore, close to Japan's oil supplies but where comprehensive repairs could not be undertaken, or attempting to reach Japan, where repair facilities were better but fuel was scarce. Several ships were lost in these retreat movements or while immobilized in port. The aftermath and strategic consequences of the Battle of Leyte Gulf were profound and far-reaching. The battle secured the beachheads of the U.S. 6th Army on Leyte against any attack from the sea. However, months of hard fighting would be required before the island was completely in Allied hands at the end of December 1944. The battle on land was fought in parallel with continued air and sea campaigns as the Japanese attempted to reinforce and resupply their troops on Leyte, while the Allies worked to interdict them and establish air and sea superiority. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered the greatest loss of ships and crew in its entire history. The failure to dislodge the Allied invaders from Leyte meant the inevitable loss of the Philippines, which in turn meant that Japan would be effectively cut off from its occupied territories in Southeast Asia. These territories provided resources that were absolutely vital to Japan's ability to continue the war, particularly the oil needed for ships and aircraft. The problem was compounded because the shipyards and sources of manufactured goods, such as ammunition and fuel refineries, were located in Japan itself. The loss of Leyte also opened the way for the eventual invasion of the Ryukyu Islands, including Okinawa, in 1945. The remaining major Imperial Japanese Navy surface ships returned to their bases where they would languish, entirely or almost entirely inactive, for the remainder of the war. Just as Japanese naval airpower had been crippled in June of 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the naval engagements at Leyte Gulf broke the Imperial Japanese Navy's surface fleet as a meaningful threat to Allied command of the sea. The only major operation by these surface ships between the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the surrender of Japan was a suicidal sortie in April of 1945, part of Operation Tengo, in which the battleship Yamato and her escorts were destroyed in a completely lopsided engagement by American carrier aircraft before they could reach Okinawa. The first organized use of kamikaze aircraft took place following the Leyte landings, beginning with an attack on the Australian heavy cruiser Australia on October 21. Organized suicide attacks by the Special Attack Force began in earnest on October 25 during the closing phase of the Battle off Samar, when a kamikaze sank the escort carrier St. Lo. This marked the beginning of a terrifying new phase in the Pacific War, as Japan increasingly turned to suicide tactics in its desperate attempt to stave off defeat. The distinguished military historian J.F.C. Fuller wrote of the outcome of Leyte Gulf that the Japanese fleet had ceased to exist, and except by land-based aircraft, their opponents had won undisputed command of the sea. When Admiral Ozawa was questioned about the battle after the war, he replied that after this battle, the surface forces became strictly auxiliary, and they relied on land forces, special kamikaze attacks, and air power. There was no further use assigned to surface vessels, with the exception of some special ships. Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai, Navy Minister in the Japanese cabinet, said he realized that the defeat at Leyte was tantamount to the loss of the Philippines. As for the larger significance of the battle, he stated simply, "I felt that it was the end." The Battle of Leyte Gulf stands as a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the brutal reality of naval warfare. From the determined submarine attacks in Palawan Passage to the desperate defense by the destroyers and escort carriers off Samar, from the methodical destruction of the Southern Force in Surigao straight to the pursuit of Ozawa's decoy force off Cape Ingano, this battle encompassed the full spectrum of naval combat. It demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of naval power, the critical importance of intelligence and communication, and the devastating effectiveness of coordinated air and sea operations. Most importantly, it marked the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force and secured Allied control of the Philippine waters, paving the way for the eventual liberation of the Philippines and the final push toward the Japanese home islands. The Battle of Leyte Gulf remains not only the largest naval battle of World War II but one of the most significant naval engagements in all of human history, a pivotal moment when the outcome of the Pacific War was decisively determined in the waters surrounding the Philippine archipelago.